Good morning, everybody. There's a subtext of geopolitical competition that's widely studied and is studied here at Stanford and the Institute for International Studies. But I want to underscore that there are many policy objectives in the world. And there are many policy jurisdictions carved up by boundaries that are enforced by military might, tested at the different intervals that you will see historians chronicle about things like war. Well, the global goals also manifest in other types of policy documents, like the ones that the most powerful 20 nation states negotiate amongst themselves. So yes, there are nearly 200 nations on Earth, each of whom are represented by an anointed head of state, but the 20 most powerful nations take closed-door meetings amongst themselves to produce policy platform statements, like the most recent one from the G20. And what I want you to see here is to see how the Sustainable Development Goals are elevated in the document. These are not out of fashion, antique, something cute that happened a decade ago. When India hosted the G20 and got a chance to set the agenda, they're centering the negotiations in a 37-page statement of policy in an organizational way that traces directly back to that global goals negotiation. They're reaffirming those goals and organizing political conversations with their counterparties around them. Now, among all of those people who are asked to represent all of the people, 7 billion, 8 billion and counting, we all share one Earth, one atmosphere, and you know about the contamination of the atmosphere from fossil fuels. It's the #1 thing that we talk about in the first day of this class. But how many people have ever had an assignment or in your own real life on your own volition read the summary for policymakers from the special report on 1.5 degrees? It's the most widely read text the IPCC has ever released. And in the summary for policymakers, figure 1, if you don't read, it's just a picture. And it says, this is where we have already been. That 1.5 degrees is a target that we think you have asked us to study, because that was the nature of the special report. The policymakers asking the scientists, study what it takes to get to 1.5. They did the math, and you can see X marks the spot. At 2040, they're looking at exceeding 1.5, and that was 6 years ago, before 6 years of science documented an acceleration of that warming curve, shows that it's not linear at all. It's accelerating. So the first and second derivative of the plot line are dangerous. Now, below that same figure, there's this one. It's part of the same picture. And it says this is the emissions pathway for carbon dioxide that would be consistent with that 1.5 degree. And I blew it up. I'm sorry about the pixelization there. I blew it up so that you could just see the scientists' representation of this line graph is unmistakable. It's the mathematic picture of abolition. Scientists didn't write in the special report, pardon me, heads of state, we presume that you understand this line graph and are planning to abolish the open burning of fossil fuels using the sky as a sewer without any penalty or incorporated cost. No, they didn't say it exactly like that. They gave them a picture, and if you sit there long enough and look at that picture and try to negotiate, you're like, yeah, I think they basically said cut it out. Well, how to get there? Isn't that the question? Isn't that a big motivating line of inquiry for so many people? The same IPCC special report presents 4 different possibilities for how humanity might evolve in its thinking and behavior patterns across all the heterogeneity, across culture and positionality. And because none of them among the scientists could guarantee that any one of these socio-cultural economic futures was going to be the future, they described 4 different futures. And on the left-hand side, you might, if you can read that, think about the scenario in which social, business, and technological innovations result in lower energy demand up to 2050, while standards of living rise, especially in the global south. This is like the global goals dream on the left. Way over here on the right. Resource and energy-intensive scenario in which economic growth and globalization lead to widespread adoption of greenhouse gas-intensive lifestyles, including high demand for transportation fuels and livestock products. This is essentially the climate nightmare. Now, if you study these scenarios, which were in fact part and parcel of the dissertation I mentioned to you earlier, you will come to know this yellow area under the line is the scientists' presumption that there will be sufficient investment in innovation for carbon dioxide to be removed from the atmosphere. Stanford University had a chance to choose any topic on Earth to prioritize with the Sustainability Accelerator, and the very first flagship destination the university chose was to solve the technological pathways for what would be necessary to accomplish that yellow swath. What does that tell you about where the decision makers' heads are in thinking about which one of these scenarios is unfolding in front of us? And what are the implications of that for you when you think about, well, who's making the rules around here? What are the rules that frame the behavior patterns and ultimately whether or not we're achieving global goals or diverging from them? And that's really the invitation of today's class. So all of the heads of state who have participated in the international climate negotiations have registered with the world their plan for doing something about it. This register is a kind of a record that anyone with a web browser can go to download. Well, what are we going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? But last year was the conclusion of the first taking of stock of how we were doing, also called in jargon speak a global stock take. And the stock taking showed that what was pledged and what had been achieved was not nearly enough to meet the 1.5 degree scenario that had been published in 2018. So it is important then to see under the hood of all of these pledges. Okay, I pledge to get rid of fossil fuels out of my power sector by 2035, says Joe Biden. Other people say other things. What are you gonna do exactly to achieve what you said you were going to do in the registry? That's where policy starts to get real, and you start to come into encounter political science, political economy, politics. So here is the International Energy Agency's account of all of the policies that have been reported by all of the nations that have nationally determined contributions to do something about fossil fuel burning in the atmosphere. And you can go to this database and read about these policies. Now, policy databases like that didn't exist when the United States was nevertheless transitioning through multiple energy regimes. And policy was a major factor at each stage. The United States started out with more or less, look on the left-hand side, biomass that was being unsustainably harvested. It was not a sustainable future, but it was using a renewable fuel. Virtually 100% of the old-growth forests were decimated as the imperial colonial invasion of the Westward Manifest Destiny Front took the rest of that timber. But they were burning a lot of it for heat and steam. And when the Industrial Revolution happened, it was euphoric. It was euphoric. Coal, of course, drove industrialization, which created mechanization and some of the capacity to do the kind of drilling that the wildcatters did that opened up the oil fields. And the rest of the stories will be told to you in Understand Energy. What I want to do next is show you a flowchart diagram that goes along with this transition. It's flowing the potential energy that's represented in the supplies of energy on what is your left side to the uses on your right side. So we just came through almost 100 years of the United States history, and now we're coming into the 20th century. Look at what's happening in the dynamism of energy transitions. Watch electrification take off. Boom. Watch suburbia take off. Petroleum dominates the transportation sector. And in Understand Energy, every single introduction of the resources on the left will include a representation of where it's going on the right, what fraction of it is used for this, that, and the other. And every investigation of the sectors on the right is going to include an allocation or an attribution to where is all that energy coming from. Well, mostly comes from this, comes from that. What I'm asking you to do is get your mind out of what the pie charts look like for 2021 and just look at almost 200 years of energy transition history that I just showed you in an animation that came from some wonderful researchers to make it available online. Now, as credited, that US energy history visualization gives you a sense that there is transition already happening. So it's not like we're having some status quo and then it's going to transition. But there's something really important about the dimensions of this graph. Who can see like the 1 pixel wide thing labeled solar at the top? You're staking your future on a renewable energy transition. And you just watched how many decades it takes to transition an economy. With all of the policy forcing mechanisms that were already applied to produce the drama that I already showed you. Trying to get a transition that is as fast as retiring all of the gas and coal from open burning in the sky and the combustion of fossil fuels, mostly for high-speed transportation, in the next 2 decades. What does that look like on this flowchart? It looks like a meteor strike. It looks like a detonation. It looks like somebody, kaboom, and then the whole thing turns into like red, blue, and yellow, and all of the green, blue, and black go away. That is the incredible pressure on policy right now. The incredible pressure to change the rules of the game, to change the direction of the system. I do want you to leave class today with a sense of humility about what it means to get to 100% clean energy if what you are talking about is taking a system that is transitioned over decades like that and running something that has a slope so steep we've never seen it on a system that's never been as big as the one we have now. It's also why Stanford introduced this quarter the class called Scaling Sustainability Solutions, where the university itself is acknowledging it's not just discovering how to do a thing, but that actually the scaling function itself is worthy of attention and innovative research. So one of the prevailing policy theses is that we're going to innovate our way into a new technology set. If we invest in research and commercialization, it's all going to work. Because doesn't it work? I mean, we invest in innovation, we do more production deployment, the economies of scale give us new learning curves, prices go down, installations go up, that virtuous cycle. Well, in principle, it works. But friends, this has not given us anything more than 1 pixel wide solar, right? So we're talking about looking for a step change in deployment that this particular theory is not adequately delivering. I'm not disputing that this theory produces a virtual cycle of deployment and lower prices, but is it happening fast enough? Absolutely. It cannot be proven that this market transformation theory is good enough to leave the energy sector alone without additional policy. And of course, the energy sector is already structured around optimizations of business interests within containers of policies that already exist. So then the questions become, when are those policies going to change? How many people remember the Green New Deal when it hit the headlines first in 2018, 2019? Let's show you hands. And this type of direct action organizing by people who are your age and not a minute older, arriving at the Capitol building to say, we're pretty sure the prevailing policy of the only party that cares about energy transition enough to try to propel it is, I think it says, bringing squirt gun to a fire. It's not enough to manifest that dramatic change that I just described to you is mathematically necessary to meet the moment. So not only did they win the day in changing the national conversation, those young people in their political organizing to change policy fought first to build power. The first thing they did was build power. And one of the most dramatic ways that they did that was focus on a few key races, take on the incumbents, and put them out of work. And that is the story of the famed AOC, the celebrity member of Congress that you know now, was once a bartender, taking on a man who was supposed to be Nancy Pelosi's successor, Joe Crowley. And when she said not so fast and they rallied behind her and ended his career, who took notice? The party. The party took notice. And it changed the politics of the party. The demands of the Green New Deal champions, and particularly those in the Sunrise Movement, went on to define the next administration and its climate policy. And that's worthy of a whole study. How they did that and which policy documents they affected, who they organized with and what kind of pressure they applied, they are worthy of respect. And there's a wonderful book called Winning the Green New Deal that is an anthology of many people who are involved in that moment of history. Now, the Biden administration, not only within the first week, signed an executive order saying, we're here and we hear you. But in that executive order, they said, we hear you out across the landscape, where there are many people who are not benefiting from the clean energy economy that we already have, the transitions that are already underway. We know that this prevailing policy regime of innovation and commercialization systematically prefers to sell products into affluent markets first, because that's where they believe there are people who have enough discretionary income to pay for a green premium necessary to sustain a company through its valley of death. We study these strategies and teach them here at Stanford. But what it means that if clean energy transition is only happening in neighborhoods where there's a money flood, what's happening in the places where policies have systematically produced money deserts? And what is the history of those policies that have produced money deserts? What is the racial history of the United States and the policies of distributive equity and inequity that produce those money deserts? And then what does it mean for a clean energy economy to essentially have a commercialization path that is splitting the heart of the base of support for the only national party that has an interest in propelling energy transition? Friends, that's actually dangerous. So the Biden administration, in its week 1 executive order, said 40% of all of the federal benefits for policies on climate action and clean energy should aim to land in the areas that are shaded gray on this map, and they were dubbed by that executive order Justice 40 areas. How many people have heard of the Justice 40 policy? It's not a law. It came out of the president's declaration of an executive order that affects all agencies and therefore affects all policies propagated by all agencies and their interpretation of the law coming from Congress for all of the policies they are authorized to implement. What a powerful intervention, the Justice 40 policy. Energy justice, represented by the Justice 40 policy, has 4 different tenets, and they're on the screen above my head without needing narrative. But I want to draw a tight tie in my remarks here between procedural equity and distributive equity. The idea that it is unlikely that you will get fair outcomes if you don't have a fair process. It is unlikely if you don't have a representative body of people participating in the process of deciding how things are going to be distributed, that they will be distributed equitably. And the inequities that are apparent both in society and in American politics today partially illuminate why it has seemed so frustrating, even maddening, just anguish. Why is it so hard to get clean energy solutions to people who would benefit from them most? What are the politics that are preventing those policies from actually being adopted and replicated widely? So let's move beyond procedural equity and distributive equity to recognition and repair to close out this vignette before we start using these concepts. Recognition justice means to actually accept and regard that there has been harm. To recognize first that there are national sacrifice zones around every uranium mine feeding the supply lines to the nuclear power industry. If you don't recognize those national sacrifice zones, would you ever even undertake the conversation about what it would take to restore them? That's how those concepts are connected. And the same is true for refineries, which I think in the future of the 21st century, we look back and say, refineries also were categorically sacrificed, or they sacrificed the places where they were put, and there isn't really a plan to remediate those locations for living on that land. Those are important things to keep in mind when you come face to face with communities that may be described by field jargon terms, fence line communities, or environmental justice communities, place-based peoples who are like, hey, I live in a place that has been radically harmed by the industrialization process, and I am looking for a transition to the next thing that is different than the transition that got us here. What got us here is not going to get us there. So if a utilitarian justice philosophy, greatest good for the greatest number, told us that we didn't really matter in that math, we want to talk to you about a different concept of justice, like the Rawlsian theory of justice, where if it's not fair for the most disadvantaged person in the situation, it's not going to produce a fair outcome. And now you get into the language you might see in our policy space now of disadvantaged communities who are looking for a process that prioritizes their interest for the benefit of outcomes that would actually be most useful for everyone. I'm going to pause for a second. How is that vignette of your experience in this hour thinking about policy landing for you?
In a country like India, how do you balance the greater good versus taking care of the most impoverished communities?
This question is the philosopher's question. Is utilitarianism, which is often used to justify judgments that are made by international finance institutions driving the distribution of money into infrastructure projects around the world, greatest good for the greatest number, studied in science, technology, and society here at Stanford, how does that concept philosophy square with the one that says, if we're not actually prioritizing the people for whom the transition would have the greatest impact, what sort of popular support do we expect as some sort of entitlement to enjoy to defend this policy portfolio against a continuous attack from one of the most profitable industries on earth, willing to go to no end to defend their market share in the energy sector? That is the work of political scientists, political policy specialists, and even people like John Krasnick, who's a specialist in communications here at Stanford, thinking about how different policies play to different constituencies to try to understand what reconciliation policymakers need to have in policies like the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which we're going to talk about just next. Thank you for contributing that question. This chart right here, which I urge you to study in your own time, comes from the International Association for Public Participation. And if you read it from left to right, you can get the idea that on the left-hand side, most people are disenfranchised from the development of clean energy policies. And on the right-hand side, they're deeply engaged in it. And the difference between those two has a material effect on the durability of that policy, which is important to people who are in business if they are looking for stable, enabling environments. Enabling environments is a catchphrase in our field for people who have investment capital at risk that could be lost with a rapid change in policies that destabilize their market conditions. If they're looking for stable enabling conditions, then they need stable policy. And when you look here from the left to the right, you can see that if you have a disenfranchised populace, you won't have very strong defenses of the policies that you put in place. And when the next regime comes in, they can be uprooted very, very quickly. But if they're deeply rooted at multiple levels of jurisdiction and across and reinforced by multiple authorities, it's much harder to change the direction of the market transformation. That's one way to make the case for prioritizing procedural equity. Now, I was telling you earlier about the story of the Green New Deal, and on the left-hand side, I want you to actually see how big the vision was for the Green New Deal when it was first introduced. The people who wrote the Green New Deal did not miscalculate what it would cost. If anything, you might look back at that math and say, it was an understatement. It was just what would be needed in the period of time of 10 years. Whatever you want to think about the politics, you do need to regard what happened to the policy. In each stage of negotiation thereafter, it was diminished until there was finally something left, the remnants of the original set of demands that could be enacted into law. And when it was, there was a euphoric expression of victory by the Democratic Party, running through the landscape with a super cape on, telling everyone the truth. This was the biggest federal investment in clean energy ever. And when you look at it in the context of the original set of political demands, you know that that is just unfinished business. It's unfinished business. So here's what happened in the pair of bills that were passed, both the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, here represented in dark black for IRA and gray for Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. The reason why they are separate is because they were split apart in a political bargaining process that let a set of policies that are mostly under the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation proceed, while those that are mostly under the jurisdiction of the EPA and the Department of Energy were held back, and actually they were abandoned and then they were resuscitated. This chart shows you where the federal funds are intended to flow by the category of energy types that you'll be studying in this class. This next diagram shows you how the money would flow there. Not what the money was for, but how. That's the policy instrument. And what you can see is that the dominant strategy was to use the tax code adjudicated by members of the Ways and Means Committee and not the appropriations process, or using budget reconciliation, which is jargon I know, but a special legislative process to spend money. Instead, they said, we're going to reduce the tax liabilities for businesses primarily. This is the #1 US energy policy strategy for clean energy transition. And when you study this chart, there's not another interpretation of what it means. That's also why Stanford brought Luke Bassett, the director for program implementation at the US Treasury for the Inflation Reduction Act, to address the Stanford Energy Seminar this spring, and it's recorded. You can see it on the Stanford Energy channel, to talk exactly about the implementation of those tax credits, but not only the ones for businesses, but also the ones for nonprofits. For the first time in history, the Inflation Reduction Act leveled the playing field and made it possible for clean energy investments to be profitably made by nonprofit corporations. Let me be more blunt. From 2005 until 2022, for more than a decade and a half, it was the United States policy that clean energy investments were most lucrative in the hands of people who are part of the global capital markets and invested in capitalist enterprises. And every church, tribe, municipal government, nonprofit organization, school district could go pound sand. Not only that, all of the nonprofit utilities were systematically disqualified from the financial incentives to participate in the clean energy economy, and that included the entire electric cooperative system serving 42 million Americans in rural America that are almost ubiquitously represented by the opposition party to energy transition in the United States today. What kind of policy would that be? You wanted to run a clean energy transition and only let some people into the game and actually deliberately and systematically for more than 17 years in a row cast everybody who lives in a landscape that's dominated by your opposition party out of the clean energy transition. How did you expect that clean energy transition to have durable political popular support? So that was finally moved with the Inflation Reduction Act's revision of the tax code called the elective pay option. There's so much to say about energy policy. If you were me, I hope you would take pity on the difficulty of discerning which things to draw to your attention. But this is one of them. Now, in addition to offering those tax credits for clean energy, there was a bonus tax credit offered. And there are 22 different tax credits. Some of them are eligible for this bonus. This map is on energycommunities.gov, and it is specifically for places where a coal power plant has been retired or will soon be retired, and its adjacent counties. So the dark oranges are where the power plants are, light oranges are the counties surrounding it. Or, Boolean function, places where the fraction of people employed in parts of the economy that are attributed to the fossil fuel industry exceeded a certain threshold. So that's all the purple there. Excuse me, look at the entire state of Alaska. Now, the leading member of the United States Senate Energy Committee represents what? The Republican senator for Alaska knows that every ounce of investment in clean energy in Alaska is going to get the bonus tax credit as a result of this policy. This policy is a part of a concept called just transitions. That if we're going to have an energy transition, we're going to be mindful about the places that are dependent on the fossil economy today, and we're going to make it actually a policy to induce money to flow into those places and spaces. We've gotten this far on narrative alone without me actually delving into just the tightest bit of policy. What is policy? Maybe some of you have taken a public policy class before. This might be your only slide in this class on this topic. Think about who's in charge around there and what kind of power they have to make things different. The power they have to make things different means they're using a policy instrument of some sort. What policy instrument would that be, and how would you know that that's the policy? Did they publish it in the newspaper? Did they make a rule? Did they pass a law? What is the record of that decision, and who is supposed to comply with it? Who's subject to that policy, and what happens when they don't comply? Who enforces it? If you can describe a policy with that checklist, you've got most of the components of its anatomy. And if you're missing one, there's probably something to check in that blind spot, because it could break very easily if you don't know who's covered or you don't know who's going to enforce it. Policies that aren't enforceable, how good are they for policy? Here behind me is a list of examples. Different types of policy instruments that authorities at different levels of jurisdiction use in countries around the world to shape the incentive structures for investors in the energy sector, and now are using these same instruments to induce capital to flow into investments in clean energy. An example is building codes. Building codes are an expression of a bare minimum floor. A bare minimum floor. If you build a building less than this, it's illegal in terms of energy performance. But look at the heterogeneity of adoption of the building codes, which in the United States is essentially remanded to the states. All of those orange and red states have building energy codes that are more than a decade out of date. When we're building new building stock and not using the best practices that Peter Rumsey teaches in his building energy efficiency design class, we're losing our opportunity right there. Building codes have a cousin, and that's appliance standards. If you make a product that's in a covered category and its energy performance is less than the standard requires, it's illegal to sell it in the United States. Organizations like CLASP work with nations around the world to establish those appliance standards so that equipment that is just endemically wasting energy doesn't come into the borders of that nation, and tries to drive the market, the entire market, towards more efficient services. Another type of policy is what federal and state governments, even down to your municipal governments, do with the lands that they control. Not only do they have the option to deploy solar on them, even down to the school district level, but they have the option to lease lands for renewable energy development, including drilling for enhanced geothermal resources like the company Fervo is doing. Offshore wind is another area where the authorities that control space, not space, but areas, spatial planning, have a big factor in whether or not that resource becomes available. Political power is a component of the shaping of policy that I cannot overlook. The ability to change the conditions in which decisions are being made is formative to the outputs of those processes. Politics is the process of applying that power, and it results in the topography that you see of advantage and disadvantage. That's not just the distance that you can describe of the neighborhoods around this university, which you can observe, and Stanford does through the Partnerships for Climate Justice, recognize the difference in political power, access, and advantage in the outcomes of policies that produce money, floods, and deserts right around here. But in a global sense also, it is exceedingly difficult for nation states that have been subjected to policies of human development over a century to overcome the patterns of indebtedness that have been used to describe their advancement in order to hold to account the nations that were in the G20 that I talked to you about at the beginning. That is another way of expressing the challenges in mobilizing and applying political power to produce different outcomes in policy. These contests are so legendary that they are studied by historians and written about by best-selling authors like Václav Smil and Daniel Yergin. I think Open Veins of Latin America and Arundhati Roy's Power Politics also belong on that list. Now, these books are so famous in our field because they're telling the story of the power politics, as Arundhati Roy's book is described, the contest for power in order to change the rules of the market that would reward people who are making investments in transitions. And people who study in energy transitions come out of a scholarly heritage of the study of transitions writ large. Cultural anthropologists study human cultural transitions and have for time immemorial. Over on the left-hand side, indigenous peoples have right claim to expertise in environmental studies long before it was defined by the academy as some sort of derivation of civil engineering. Indigeneity and the knowledge for how to live sustainably in a place may be an original form of environmental studies, but in the later 20th century, the combination of environmental studies and the philosophers dating back for way before Greek times took concepts of justice and environmental studies, combining them into a field that is marked in its foundations to a direct action protest in my home state of Warren, North Carolina, where African American residents refused to be sacrificed as yet another national sacrifice zone when someone thought it would be a good idea to put a hazardous toxic waste dump in their place. Environmental justice and energy justice are related. And there are many tenets of environmental justice that help us understand the application of the concepts of energy justice that I introduced earlier. And between the study of energy transitions and the study of energy justice, that's where you will find people who are digging into the bedrock of what would it mean to achieve a just transition. That is the location of just transition scholarship. If you wanted to know what just transition demands look like when animated, you would look at the 2014 People's Climate March around Columbus Circle near Central Park in New York City. It was a tremendous day. I don't think the world has seen such a large concentration of people marching on climate action since then, and it's been 10 years. But look who's in the front. Young people are in the front. People of color are in the front. Indigenous groups known by their signs with the Climate People's Alliance, the Climate Justice Alliance, are in the front, and on purpose, too, by design. So when those folks are looking at the stakes and the towering imbalance of power that young people have compared to gray-haired authorities in every jurisdiction, what kind of power can they mobilize besides what they are describing and animating in the streets of New York City as distress? This sentence is the one sentence that I know that I can offer you to read both forwards and backwards to try to understand the linkages and where they might intervene. So to finish this exercise, work with me back from the bottom. If you thought something mattered enough to express extreme distress, which is, by the way, something you can detect and observe around the world, you needed something to be different, you needed something to make a difference, and you needed it fast. We already looked at the dimensions of time described earlier. Then you were going to be looking for something that would give you a large enough scale to transition a system that is operating at the scale that we have, and for that you need solutions that are infused with a certain amount of fuel called money that is going to drive the deployment of whatever technological solution set is going to displace the basic human needs that are being delivered now, and even beyond that, the economic demands that are being placed on authorities around the world to provide stability for people who are currently using fossil fuels. Well, there's no investor on earth who's going to start throwing whatever private capital they have into a marketplace that isn't actually producing the valid rewards that their fiduciaries require. Actually, by the way, it's illegal if they do. Throwing away investors' cash is not only not fashionable, it can put you in a heap of trouble. So if you are a manager working on behalf of a corporation, your legal obligation is to enrich those investors. And if the market conditions aren't good for you, you're not going there. Who makes those market conditions? Obviously, we've talked about rules and how powerful rulemaking can be, but who makes the rules? That's where we turn the corner from economics into policy, and we get into the study of political economics, where the policymakers are negotiating power, and the power that they are negotiating is actually built and developed by the capacity to enforce. And sometimes that enforcement is the ability to take you out of office, like I described in a scenario just a few minutes ago, but sometimes it's military power. So now you can think to yourself, wow, if we were trying to transition the energy economy of a jurisdiction that's inside the boundaries that are being enforced by whatever power is there defending boundaries, could be city, state, national, we are looking for the development of a level of political power that would be strong enough to drive changes in the policies that would produce different rule signals that would produce. That is exactly what happened when the Green New Deal went through the system and came out as the Inflation Reduction Act. The only open challenge is that it came out at a magnitude that is a tiny fraction of what's ultimately needed, and that sends us right back into the cycle. Well, where do we go get that kind of political power? One mitigating and complicating factor is that this set of relationships is not untethered from the reality of tampering. It is tampered with around the world by the use of market power, by accumulated fortunes that are being spent into a political process that is frankly very cheap to distort. And it can be cheap to distort at a pedestrian level, like the person at the gate, like, hey, I'll give you $5 if you let me through the gate. Or the person at the very big gate, like, hey, I'll make sure that your family's taken care of forever if you give me this thing I need. And these kinds of negotiations of power that happen between people who have the responsibility to exercise authority give people concern about the integrity of the policy process, which brings us back to procedural equity. But I want to show you something that's unique to the United States, which is some level of transparency in the data about money flows in this system. The federal government does require that funds spent on political influence be reported if they are spent in one of three ways. Here is one of them, which is spending money just to try to persuade somebody that they should fear you enough to not do something that makes you mad, and that they would be rewarded enough to do something that makes you happy. That is a kind of colloquial definition of lobbying. But look what happened here when the Waxman-Markey bill, the first major climate bill in US history, was introduced in 2009, and it introduced cap and trade for the first time. It had a meltdown in the Senate after it passed the House, but once the oil and gas industry built its $100 million a year cadre of cottage industry lobbyists, they did not stop. They have spent more than $1 billion influencing 500 people. Only 500 people. This is only the money that's required to be disclosed for spending time trying to persuade one of those 500 people. 528 to be exact. For those of you that are wondering, that last bar is not a depiction of a decline. It's just that we haven't finished the year yet. So those data have not been reported. Now, when you look into the data, it is important to regard the political split, the party split. Where's the oil and gas money going when it's being spent into the political system to change the policy outcomes? The ratio is so strong that you could have some empathy for a member of the party that opposes clean energy transition for why that might be so. The party itself is dependent upon this type of patronage at the scale that we're seeing. And over the course of 35 years, that pattern has produced an indelible mark on the two-party system of the United States, between one party that has an interest in clean energy transition and another party that has sought at different points to undermine it at almost every level. That is a tough thing to face. But the data underneath the money flows help us understand, like, well, I think that looks kind of rational. I guess I can understand what kind of pressure those decision makers might be under. But the two data sets that I just showed you are only for data that was being paid for lobbying or paid directly to campaign contributions. This data set shows you in a gray line chart that also, since 2010, when the Waxman-Markey bill failed in the Senate, the United States political system has seen a huge takeoff in the amount of money, and I should have made sure I added the top label here. This is still the data set out of the oil and gas summary. The oil and gas industry has preferred to spend more money in outside groups where the reporting requirements are less and you can see less of where it's going. So they're spending money on other organizations that perform influence functions, and they could be buying ads on Facebook, they could be buying front page articles on the USA Today newspaper, they could be participating in any number of influence activities that are also studied by our communications experts here at Stanford. Now, the members of Congress are shattered across all of these different committees. So if you care about different parts of the energy economy, there is a different set of committees that you might want to go to find the policies that they are developing. And when Joe Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, that was a bill that was coming out of the committee that was responsible for infrastructure, but not for environment and public works, not for energy and natural resources, mostly. When you open up the bipartisan infrastructure bill, it looks like a shopping list. This is just the number of line items assigned to authorities that the Department of Energy has. If you come to the Stanford Energy Seminar next week, you'll be able to hear from Karen Skelton, who's a visiting scholar now at the Precourt Institute for Energy, who played an instrumental role in moving from the politics of what could be agreed to by some members of the Republican Party with the Democrats to pass this bill, which resulted in something down here at the bottom, $75 billion in clean energy spending, to what came next, which was the Inflation Reduction Act. And Karen's history and contribution to national policy in this tender moment of negotiation between the types of figures that you see pictured on the screen here is fascinating. And I think that her remarks next Tuesday at Stanford Energy Seminar will reward you for the time. If you open up the Inflation Reduction Act, it's 1,000 pages, you will see an unending number of policies that you can get interested in. But you can also go to energycommunities.gov to surf the database that renders all of that 1,000 pages of cursive italicized text into actually the information you need. Where are the tax credits? Where can I compete for grants? And where is money already going to flow? Like $225 million that Wahala Johns was telling the Stanford Energy Seminar just 2 days ago is going to flow to the 500 and some tribes that have been recognized by the federal government because it's a formula. They're going to receive the funds directly. They don't have to compete for it, and they're not going to get special tax credits. That's the money they get, walking money, to start managing that transition. So I encourage you to go to energycommunities.gov as an exercise to stave your curiosity. What I'm trying to transition from now is from where we started at the beginning of our time at a global level. We moved into some national politics, which I used as a vehicle for talking about some policy and political concepts. Now to close, I want to make sure that your mind isn't stuck at that sort of banner headline commercial media level, but that you're thinking about what's happening in those intergovernmental levels at state government and local government. If there is a Department of Energy at the federal government, there is a Department of Energy at the state government. If there is somebody at the state government who's responsible for energy policy, they know somebody in your town who's responsible for helping enforce it, all the way down to enforcing building codes. Now, 25 or so of those states have bound together in a climate policy alliance and pooled information about the policies that they're implementing in their jurisdictions. And that database now has more than 2,000 entries. This is a very rich resource for people who are looking about ideas and precedents. I want a policy that will do this. Who knows where I could find a place where that's already been tried? Maybe I could find somebody there to talk to who has experience. This database is open to all. When you get into it, you will be able to not only navigate narrative descriptions, you'll be able to sift and sort at data.usclimatealliance.org, which is a big pool of information that each state is contributing to, so that all of you who are perhaps data scientists can mine and reproduce insight for the decision makers that you're working with. If you are in a jurisdiction at a state level that you think needs to transition faster, or that you think has the potential and really the responsibility to use the instruments available to complement those that are being expressed at the federal level, you might choose the State Policy Opportunity Tracker, which has a neat acronym, SPOT. And it is maintained by the Colorado State University Center for New Energy Economy. And it goes through a whole set of categories of different types of energy policy areas, and then gives you a sense of whether or not there's any kind of headroom. This is the example for California, where it gives you a sense of like a gas fuel tank being empty or full. And they're saying that California's got pretty good policies in some places, but in other places it could be doing better. And every state has one of these kinds of opportunity trackers. You will also be able to find at the Advanced Energy Legislation database an account of every new legislative bill idea that's been introduced in any one of the state jurisdictions and been in consideration not only in this legislative session, but in every legislative session. I think it goes back almost a decade. And not only the bills that have passed, it will tell you the record of all the things that have been tried and failed. This is another incredibly powerful source of insight about policy and what's been working in the field. So to close, I want to commend to you some places that you can go to keep track of the daily drama of energy policy, because it might not always be served up to you on what's trending in your social media platform of preference. If you want to be a player in the energy space, it pays to be able to keep track with the best intelligence. And the intelligence is brought by paid reporters and journalists who are talking to sources that aren't often sought out by the people who are selling 1 million clicks per article. E&E News is one such vendor. There's also Energy News Network, which is a nonprofit, not for profit. And it is organized by region, and it's a clipping service, which is different. They don't have very many original articles, but they'll serve you up a curated set. And it's very interesting to see how different regions are experiencing different types of policy challenges. Well, friends, that's about it for me. What I hope that I have done in the last hour and 20 minutes is give you a tour de force of what it could look like to balance your diet of techno-optimism with the reality that building power and insisting upon procedural equity to produce distributively equitable results is necessary to sustain popular support for the enabling environments that investors require, for their investments to be rewarded at a scale that you need for the transition you want.